especially in the antebellum era, and pursuant to the ideology and tenets of Calhounism, which we discussed in a previous episode. The governing principle of the Democratic Party, as far as their political purposes and ambitions went, were the expansion of slavery into new territories and regions, and also constant attempts to recruit federal protections for slavery. Of course, both of these hopes or attempts or pursuits or what have you are rejections of the founding era understanding of the institution. And then several large-scale events really help to illustrate this, which are going to be covered in this and subsequent episodes, specifically the annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, the Ostend Manifesto, and a series of smaller events as well, which will be covered kind of in a single episode. So in dealing with the annexation of Texas, to kind of set the groundwork here, there was never a Democrat president in office, an administration, especially when, as seems to be the case historically, were often elected with a significant, if not majority, control in the House and Senate. And at no time did these officials not seek some way to expand slavery, either through the purchase of new slave territory, the annexation of new slave territory, or ultimately, and this will be the case, the invasion of slave territory. And often these attempts were clandestine and followed a specific pattern where diplomatic measures would first be attempted, then purchase, and then finally some attempt to instigate an armed confrontation to justify military operations. Now, Martin Van Buren, he's kind of the first one that comes into play here. Now, he resisted the many calls from the Democratic side to annex the Texas region at this time, specifically because it would create tension in the United States by its existence as a slave territory, and also because it was very heavily laden with its own debt. Now, Texas this time, it wasn't a territory, but it had actually successfully fought a war against Mexico and established itself as an independent nation. And Texas, understandably, wanted to join the United States and be annexed because of the type of protections that would provide. They would be insulated from any future wars or aggression from Mexico, they hoped, if they were a possession of the United States. Now, John Tyler was a Jackson Democrat who assumed the presidency in 1841. They actually called him his accidency. He was the first vice president to assume the presidency because of the death of the president, in this case, William Henry Harrison, which there will be an emerging historical pattern where the death of the president results in sometimes a far worse circumstance of someone being placed into power. Now, as soon as Tyler was placed into the presidency, he began taking steps to reopen diplomatic recognition and negotiations with Texas concerning annexation. And one of the first things he did was start to fill any positions possible with government officials that favored annexation. Now, this obviously elicited immediate condemnation and threats from Mexico, threatening war, or at the very least, the severing of diplomatic relations if he continued to engage with Texas in this respect. And of course, the acquisition of slave territory far outweighed any potential for diplomatic sacrifice here. And this would be another pattern that emerges as we go through some of these events. Now, at the same time that Tyler and the Democrat Party are really trying to establish some kind of control of Texas, so is Britain. And Britain's acting the part of a mediator between the kind of the free and independent Texas nation and Mexico. And one of the tenets offered by Britain was that Texas should abolish slavery, and by doing so, it would be a gesture of goodwill. And this horrified Democratic politicians in the United States. If Texas was to become essentially a free territory, that would be problematic in two ways. First, it would remove really the incentive for acquiring Texas, because the undergirding purpose for that was to gain more political power for the slave states. Texas was a massive region at this time. They figured they could probably get 3 states out of it. So if you can get 2 out of those 3 newly formed states to be slave states, so that's 4 more senators, and then however many representatives in the House. So it was a political power play. And the other fear was that if Texas became a free territory, that would be a very close region for fugitive slaves to escape to. Instead of having to flee through the north into Canada, through the Underground Railroad, they could just run next door. So it kind of recalled the fears that revolved the Spanish Empire in Florida in the colonial era. Now, so concerned were they by this that the infamous John C. Calhoun, who at this time was serving as the Secretary of State under President Tyler, he contacted the British envoy then in Washington, and he frames their actions as an act of aggression since they were outside of their own borders. And he writes, but when Britain goes beyond her own boundaries and avows it as her settled policy and the object of her constant exertions to abolish slavery throughout the world, she makes it the duty of all other countries whose safety or prosperity may be endangered by her policy to adopt such measures as they may deem necessary for their protection. It is with still deeper concern the President regards the avowal of Lord Aberdeen of the desire of Great Britain to see slavery abolished in Texas, and, as he infers, is endeavoring, through her diplomacy, to accomplish it by making the abolition of slavery one of the conditions on which Mexico should acknowledge her independence. Now, in this particular communication, Calhoun is introducing what would be one of the most popular and unfortunately successful arguments made by Democrat statesmen during this period to expand slavery and even to enter wars on behalf of slavery. And they simply, just as they constantly phrased any anti-slavery legislation or even publications as being violence, as being an assault on their people, and therefore justifying violence and aggressive resistance, now they took that policy and made that their new foreign policy, where anytime, say in this case, Britain sought to establish some anti-slavery policy or abolitionist policy in another country, as long as that region was even close to the United States, then that was an act of aggression, and that was a national security threat. So that would, by using this language and trying to classify these events in this way, the attempt was being made to justify federal involvement. So in Calhoun's mind, if America had decided to, let's say, invade another nation, that could be justified by saying, well, yeah, but that nation is close to us, and so if it was determined itself to be abolitionist, then it would be a threat to us, and that's obviously not accurate. It would be a threat only to southern states and only to the event that their slaves could escape. But just as it was predicted in the founding era and even before, the mere existence of slavery and the obsession and fixation of the Democrat states with slavery rendered them vulnerable, which at this point was a choice that they had willingly made, rejecting new technologies, new agricultural sciences, new seed strains, and the like, all because they treasured slavery and the strange kind of racial caste system that they had built up in those states, really since the colonial era, where they themselves got to enjoy lofty seats as some type of aristocracy, while the slaves and also the overwhelming majority of, air quotes, free whites lived in a manner that was seldom much better than those of the enslaved. And so powerful were these motives and these purposes and these intentions that the Secretary of State wrote really a scathing letter to the British envoy, which is a country that we had really only become friendly with since the conclusion of the War of 1812. So that's still a tenuous kind of agreement there. Unless we make the mistake of assuming that perhaps John C. Calhoun, due to his radical nature, his anti-constitutional, anti-founding, pro-slavery kind of identity politics self, that he was an outlier. Tyler actually mimicked his communication in a lot of ways in a treaty that he then proposed to the Senate in 1844. And in this treaty, he claimed that abolition in Texas, was a direct threat to the southern slave states. And like normal, unusual, cited concerns of slave insurrection and slaves escaping. And of course, the only logical way to resist this possibility, it wasn't to imitate the North in decades worth of gradual emancipation. No, the solution was to use federal power to protect and expand slavery through annexing Texas. Now, there's going to be a little bit of administrative overlap here because James Polk, another Democrat, was elected president. And so he and Tyler actually kind of worked together between 1844 and then 1845, whenever Polk assumed power. And just to solidify how vital this was to the Democratic Party and no one else, the 1844 Democrat Party platform read in part that the reoccupation of Oregon and the reannexation of Texas at the earliest practicable period are great American measures, which this convention recommends to the cordial support of the democracy of the Union. So again, they're trying to involve the entire nation into the affairs that only impact them, which is a strange reversal of the kind of the state nullification or so-called states' rights, which is absurdity. But the Democrat Party throughout this period felt that states should be able to nullify any federal laws that they felt was unconstitutional. So I don't like that law, so I'm going to say it's unconstitutional and enforce it, which, of course, we see in the modern day also with sanctuary cities that are in direct violation of the enumerated powers given to Congress. But that wasn't really a new thing. State nullification was initially used as a means of protecting and expanding slavery. So there's a fun historical connection to explore there. The mention there of Oregon and Texas also illustrates kind of an interesting kind of example of the slave pursuit. So at the same time that the Democratic administrations are pursuing Texas relentlessly, Oregon was pretty well left to fend for itself. Now, the Oregon Territory We were in conversations with Britain at the time as far as drawing up actual distinct lines of ownership and the like. But to reduce a kind of eye-wateringly diplomatic and political thing to its simplest terms, all we would have had to have done to acquire Oregon essentially was come to an agreement and maybe offered to purchase additional land from Britain, and then we would have owned what was then the Oregon Territory. So compare that to all the difficulties involved with Texas, involving its debt, involving potential war with Mexico, the severing of diplomatic ties with Mexico, and of course running afoul diplomatically of Britain as well. So one questions, well, why this pursuit of Texas over the pursuit of Oregon? And the answer is a very simple one, and that's Oregon Territory was opposed to slavery, and Texas was not. And so it made perfect sense at the time, considering the governing philosophy of the Democratic Party, to pursue the slave territory at all costs and eventually get the other one as well if it was after the initial needs were met for the protection and expansion of slavery. So in 1845, Polk tried to circumvent the kind of existing diplomatic concerns concerning Texas by sending an unofficial emissary offering to purchase New Mexico and California for $30 million. And he wanted to kind of bypass diplomatic channels and kind of do a handshake deal. What's kind of strange about this, though, is it's really not clear how he intended to provide this funding. Had the Mexican authorities accepted, which they did not, they rejected him outright. Actually, kind of even rejected his emissary. It was a bit of an undignified proceeding. But in 1845, eventually, the bill was finally forced through Congress that approved of the annexation of Texas. And so with it, the United States acquired a significant amount of debt and new slave territory. Of course, much to the hurrahs of the Democrats in the House and the Senate and the various states and the presidency at this time. But the other side had a slightly different take on it. John Adams, he referred to this annexation as an apocalyptic event. He wrote, "The treaty for the annexation of Texas to this union was this day sent to the Senate, and with it went the freedom of the human race." And what John Adams is referring to here is that this territory would undoubtedly become slave territory, increase the power of the slave states, and with it any hope of effectively battling slavery through the federal government means, and any hope to resist that kind of perversion of the government away from the founding ideals and into the concepts of Calhounism. Now, this would be far from an isolated episode. In fact, the annexation of Texas would prove to be one of the tamer means used by Democrat administrations to acquire slave territory. The next event, unfortunately for the United States, resulted in a war, the Mexican-American War, and so we will cover that in the next episode.